Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Mad in America podcast. I'm your host for today, Ayurti Dhar, assistant professor at Mount Mary University and a science news writer at Mad in America. If you've not already, go check out some interesting news on MIA this week. There is a really interesting blog post about psychiatry's recent attempts to distance itself from the chemical imbalance theory. And there is a new study about online communities providing support to service users who are going through psychiatric drug withdrawal. On that note, we have someone today who knows a lot about survivor and service user movements. We have with us Dr. Helen Spandler, who is a professor of mental health studies at the University of Central Lancashire, the managing editor of Asylum, which is a radical mental health nonprofit magazine, which I think is going strong now for about 35 years or so. And she's also the principal investigator on a new research project about the role of zines in contesting mental health knowledge and practice. Dr. Spandler, welcome to Mad in America.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor to talk to you.
All right. So today we're going to talk about mental suffering as disability, a compassion deficit in mental health care, psychiatric neglect, and maybe more stuff. But before we begin, could you give our listeners some general idea about your approach, your stance, and also what brought you to these issues? Was there like a defining moment, or was it like a slow thing? Just a basic general idea about yourself and your work.
This area has defined my life, really, I guess, in one way or another. I grew up with sort of mental health issues in my family, and, I've had my own kind of sort of struggles up to a point. And I've always kind of found it really difficult area, and I worked in mental health for a while in mostly advocacy kind of services, sort of self and group advocacy. And I've always sort of had I guess I was quite inclined early on to have a kind of an instinctual kind of critical approach to psychiatry and psychology and all this kind of stuff. My main point of reference has always been sort of the views and experiences of psychiatric survivors, I guess, in one way or other, which is how I came to this field. My general approach has become more and more, it started off, I guess, more ideologically informed, and it's become less and less so, and I've become more and more critical of ideologically driven critiques. And I suppose more and more thinking that there's no easy answers to a lot of the complexities that we're working with in this field. So I increasingly got into research to really try and understand some of the complexities that I was facing with either trying to support family members or friends or working in advocacy and stuff that never was quite as straightforward as I hoped it would be, that I could go in and, it was just as, I found lots of tensions and contradictions and conflicts that I hadn't really anticipated. So I've always sort of been interested in looking for uncomfortable truths, if we have an idea of what the world is like, and to look at how things might not be as they seem. So I've always been interested in researching things that actually, put it in scientific terms, kind of, don't confirm our confirmation bias, if you like, that actually sort of shine a light on things in a different way. So I've always been really interested in trying to understand that. And also increasingly taking a sort of non-binary approach to these issues, sort of, instead of a sort of either or sort of, lots of ways in which the world is structured in a very binary way. And I suppose I'm increasingly sort of seeing that as a problem, I guess, and trying to sort of have a non-binary kind of approach to these issues that doesn't try and see the world in simplistic sort of, binary opposites, if you like.
Yeah.
And I guess along with that is to sort of being really suspicious of any too reductionist approach to some of these issues, either socially, usually we talk about, psychiatric reductionism, if you like, or biological reductionism, which psychiatry, has been accused of. But also, social reductionism could be problematic, or psychological reductionism as well. And I'm sort of increasingly sort of suspicious of anything that tries to reduce complex human dynamics and suffering into sort of neat, either binaries or reduction in terms of, it being all about the social or about the psychological. And I think we can easily slip into that, particularly as mental health professions are kind of, you're either a social worker, a psychiatrist, or a psychologist, So I increasingly sort of take a politically pragmatic approach to stuff, which really tries to centre human suffering. What's the best thing we can do in this context to reduce human suffering and support ourselves and each other? And this thing about sort of centering psychiatric survivor knowledge, rather than looking for the big theorists, the kind of, whether it's, people often kind of take off the shelf, Foucault or Lacan or all of this sort of stuff, but actually looking to what we might call organic intellectuals, people who, psychiatric survivors or activists who've learned their own knowledge. And it is just as theoretical, if you like, just because it's not got the big theory attached to it, and right. Sort of look to that kind of knowledge. And it's often psychiatric survivors that bring up the complexities that show up that some of our theories and ideologies don't necessarily fit. But I guess we'll get onto that somehow.
I remember, what you're talking about, that there is a complexity in these narratives. Gayatri Spivak talks about that when you actually listen to the subaltern, you will never get simple, easy answers. There is a lot of heterogeneity in what people want. And it kind of goes back to your article on saying that some psychiatric survivors want more psychiatry and some of them want less, because it's kind of the only option we have. And even that's getting gutted because of welfare, changes. Let me kind of go back to what you said. You said you're kind of moving away from ideologically driven critiques. So can you just, in a sentence, tell us what that means? I just want to, clarify it for everyone.
Yeah, it's a good point. I guess anything that sort of has a sort of totalizing narrative, I guess, around, whether it's, we can be informed by all sorts of like feminist, Marxist, anti-psychiatry, all those things, which I think are really important, maybe as milestones. But when we start to say, I'm going to take a position in relation to something, and I start with the ideology, with the theory, if you like, rather than starting with the practice or starting with what's the conditions on the ground, if you like, sort of the material conditions of people's lives. That's what matters, because I think probably we'll come on to that. But for me, it's all about context. And we have to understand the context, whether it's a historical context or current context. And I think having an ideology in mind, whether it's a theory of something, whatever it is, if we take that off the shelf and try and impose it on the world and impose it on human suffering, whatever that is, so whether it's the recovery model, whether it's a trauma model, whether it's any of these things, which in and of themselves can be really helpful. But once we sort of start to see the world through a particular theory or lens, I think it can get us into trouble, particularly when it comes to human suffering. Because what we're really talking about when we're talking about this is the diversity of human experience. And I don't think there is a theory they can certainly be influential. And I think it's really important to have that as a touchstone. I was sort of influenced very much by Marxism or historical materialism, if you like. But for me, that's not about, what did Marx say about whatever? It's saying, let's look at the material conditions of people's lives and see what the conflicts are there. I think in mental health, there tends to be, and probably in the world, we like certainty. We like something to pin things on. And particularly if you're working in mental health services, you want a theory, you want to be able to use something. And I teach a lot of social workers, and they want to know, what do we do? What's the theory? What theory do we use for this? And I'm often trying to sort of break that down, say, what really matters is being alongside somebody, trying to understand their material conditions, what they need at that time, what's best in that moment. And that usually, big theory doesn't actually help us in that. It's helpful to know the theory, and for it to be in the back of our mind. But once we start to be driven by it, I think that's the problem. Does that make sense?
We force it to conform to that pet theory that we have.
Exactly.
Absolutely, especially I've seen in psychology and mental health stuff, it tends to happen a lot. Let me jump on to our next question. You've written a lot about this, and there has been a push to see psychological suffering as a disability, especially using the social model. And in the simplest words, the social model of disability says that people may have impairments, but they're disabled because of barriers in a society. And I know there is even complexity within that model, in which there are some people who are saying, how do we define impairments and stuff? But the question is that, could you tell us what are the consequences of this disabled identity for a person who uses mental health services? Like, just on this person who's using the services and is psychologically distressed and in pain, what are the benefits or the complications of identifying as disabled as opposed to something else?
this is where I guess the thing about the context of people's lives is really important, because I mean, I started getting into this partly because if I just take a step back, when I started sort of teaching social workers about 15 so years ago, they quite like the social model of disability, which is good because I like it too. I think it's really, helpful in terms of shifting our consciousness around, as you said, stops thinking of the person as the problem, as looking at what we can do to the context. But what I found was that social workers what they did was that they sort of took the social model and they just put it on top of what they saw to be unproblematic psychiatric concepts. So they took it as read that somebody had this thing called schizophrenia or whatever, and the social model meant that we needed to look at their housing and employment and stuff. Now, that's a good start in a way, because housing, employment, things like that are really central to people's lives, obviously. But it kind of meant that the psychiatric kind of thing itself, the diagnostic stuff or how we understand people's suffering, wasn't necessarily problematized. It wasn't, it was a kind of quite a surface or weak understanding. It didn't really problematize other issues. So I wanted to sort of really think about that. And then, of course, the UN Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities came along. And, sizable number of psychiatric survivors thought this is a really useful way to go. If we define ourselves as having a disability, then we can have, we can piggyback on the rights sort of stuff around the convention, which, again, was probably some useful stuff in that. But some psychiatric survivors I knew had problematized that many years ago and said, well, there are some difficult consequences for people if you shoehorn this into a social model of disability. And some of the problems was that the social model of disability has a kind of a distinction between disability and impairment. So what is the impairment when it comes to mental distress? That becomes a difficulty. So using psychosocial disability, I think, is a helpful shift in that. But I guess what it does do, I mean, the social model of disability kind of started out, was driven by people who had long-standing, long-term physical impairments. But obviously with mental distress, we don't necessarily want to go down the road that's saying because you get this psychiatric diagnosis that you will have an impairment for the rest of your life. Like, for example, if you need a wheelchair because of a born impairment, that you will need that for the rest of your life, whatever. And it felt like it could be quite problematic to sort of impose that. But I think in relation to people's lives, I think it's very context driven, because if having a psychosocial disability can be helpful in some contexts, unhelpful in others. And I think what we have to do is try and tease that out again. So rather than saying, and I went into this thinking, and I co-edited this book, as you know, about sort of trying to understand, really the question we went in with was is a social model of disability helpful or not to mental health politics? What I ended up with is that's a stupid question. Is it yes or no? Because yes and no. And we weren't ever going to come up with yes, we've decided it is a great idea and this is how we're going to do it, or no, it's not, and junk it. That actually what we need to do is work with it and try and understand the consequences or otherwise for different people and what they need and want in a particular context. And I think that can depend on whether you want access to services and what particular service you want access to. So sometimes psychosocial disability can help with that. Getting social security benefits or welfare payments or whatever can rest on certain things like that. That can be helpful. In terms of that, the UN Convention was important around asserting rights. So I think for people with psychosocial disabilities or, psychiatric diagnosis or whatever, to be able to say, we're in this convention, therefore we can demand that we don't get certain treatments or whatever, that and we can use that framework for asserting certain rights. I think that's really helpful too. But it has some other consequences, I think, that some people wanted to sort of try to understand that might not be helpful. And then some people felt that we needed a parallel social model, if you like, that was sat alongside it, that didn't sort of say, oh, this is wrong or this is right, but that, maybe psychiatric survivors need their own sort of models. I would say that there's lots of really helpful things that you can do with the social model to make it work. For example, stuff around neurodiversity. sort of understanding the world through that lens, and understanding people that maybe have psychological diversities in some way. And that if we see people having psychological diversity, then what we need to think about is how do we adapt society to work with those diversities. So that's a kind of useful social model, I think, useful, or the trauma-informed approach is, I think, works well with a social model. So there's lots of ways I think you can adapt to that.
What would using this kind of a disability model mean for psychiatric diagnosis, and where does it fit with the DSM and the ICD?
Well, it's interesting because it could fit quite well, actually, in a way, because if you did what a lot of my social work students did, then you can just say, okay, so this person has this diagnosis, they have this illness, this disorder or whatever, and we need to adapt to that. So in a sense, it could work quite well, although, I guess most people that would take a social model would tend to sort of be more critical than that, which I guess is one of the reasons why the psychiatric survival movement has been a little bit cautious about adopting the social model. So I think it could fit, and it also has potential difficulties with that as well, because I think a deep social model starts to interrogate those very things that we call diagnoses and things like that. So you can have a sort of surface weak social model and a sort of deeper social model as well, which kind of gets into how those things get constructed. And you've written about this, haven't you? How these things get constructed at different levels culturally and socially. And stuff. So I guess it, I don't think it, I think you can have both with that, really. I don't think it necessarily, it goes with junking it or keeping it. The other thing I'd say all about context is all about the context of implementation, so how are these things implemented? And I guess the other thing is, I'd take a sort of, Joanna Moncrief's work. I don't know if you know Joanna Moncrief, who's written quite a lot about a drug-centered approach to psychiatric medication rather than a disease-centered approach, and what I think she means by that is, rather than seeing drugs as treating illnesses, we see them as psychiatric drugs, if you like. We see them as having particular effects that may or may not be helpful in particular contexts. And I think we can say the same about diagnoses as well. I think in some contexts they have particular effects that might be helpful to someone, and in other contexts they have effects that might be unhelpful. So rather than having, this is where I sort of think we can't have a pro or anti-diagnosis approach. It doesn't help us because it depends on the context. So you might need a diagnosis to get access to something, or it may be helpful for you in a particular context, but it may be really unhelpful in another context. So I think to adapt Joanna's sort of approach to medication, to diagnosis, I think would be quite helpful. And then that gets us away, because I think there's so many polarized debates going on at the moment about whether we should get rid of psychiatric diagnosis completely or whether it's helpful or not. And I think it's a really unhelpful binary, either or. And actually, I think, again, if we think about people's lives and circumstances and what they need in particular contexts, and that can shift and change.
Absolutely, yes. I think what you're saying reminds me of how people use formulations, right? So some of them would use the diagnosis and with the formulation, while others kind of prefer to not have the diagnostic category, because again, it should probably depend on the person in front of you. And,
it's kind of obvious really when you think about it, but it gets so lost, doesn't it? I think there was an interesting thing I noticed on social media recently where, someone was saying how her mental health team, I think, had started using formulation rather than diagnosis, and a sort of trauma-informed formulation. And then what happened is they started writing these complex formulations about her history, which included all sorts of personal stuff about her abuse that she didn't really want to be shared across lots of different teams, and she felt like she lost control over it. And I think the mental health workers were obviously thinking, we're being really, trauma informed, and we're doing this formulation thing, and that's really helpful because we're junking psychiatric diagnosis. But the woman said, can you give me the diagnosis back, because I didn't particularly like it, but it was better than telling everybody about my history that is personal and very private to me, and I don't want circulating. And she saw lots of notes being circulated across teams and shared with her GP and all that. Then I hadn't really thought about that before. So it was really an insight for me into, the consequences of quite well-intentioned moves to but actually had quite negative consequences for that person. And I guess that's what I mean by listening to psychiatric survivors, because there was another example. In the UK, some people recently put together, psychologists put together a report on depression. The British Psychological Society put a new report out on depression. It was quite, in many ways, a report that I would have completely signed up to a few years ago. It's very socially informed. It says, we need to problematize this idea of depression as an illness, and we need to see it as an experience. And it had a lot of really good stuff in it. But then I read a blog from a psychiatric survivor that said that she'd read the report and it absolutely devastated her, because she'd spent her whole life being told, that it was all in her head. She just needed to pull herself together. And, she'd experienced severe clinical depression over many years and really struggled to accept her experience and understand it and to kind of get validation and support for it. And then when she read this report, the depression was all inverted commas, like it didn't really. And I hadn't thought how that feels for people, to have their experience sort of in inverted commas in a way. And I've always done that. I've always put mental illness in inverted commas because I think it's a problematic concept. But I've never really considered what the impact of that is on somebody. So that's why I say, about this thing about, responding to human suffering needs to be our foremost concern, rather than do we think diagnosis is right or wrong? Because, that's not working with what the person needs in the context at that time. And those things were real eye-openers to me, where I've started to really sort of think we need to really kind of think about how these things land with people, how they're experienced. And that is, again, very different according to the person and their context and the culture and all those sorts of things that we need to take into account.
Absolutely. It reminds me of Tanya Lerman wrote about, in our work, we kind of really love the work of peer counselors, and they're really important and everything. But she had this one case of one peer counselor who had such a difficult time with his identity as now an insider, because he was working kind of around the same hospitals that he was at one point involuntarily hospitalized in. But now he had the key to those doors. So how do you deal with being now the man, but also somebody who's fought against this? And it talks about how complex these things are, despite the fact that we would like simpler answers in one direction or the other. What do you think would be the consequences, the benefits and the complications of including people with psychosocial disabilities in research and policy making? How do you think this would transform psychiatric practice?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is a hugely complex area, isn't it? Because it's so easy for us to say, and people say this all the time, we just need to put people in charge, hand everything over to service users and survivors and everything. And that's great instinct, obviously. That's where we should be starting. And we're nowhere near that. We're still very much like, trying to prise open the doors a lot of the time. But I think one of the difficulties with it is that I think there's a lack of honesty about some of the challenges of doing that and doing that really well and authentically. Ultimately, psychiatric survivors are going to differ on many different levels, and they're going to disagree as much as anyone else about stuff, and there's no homogeny, there's no kind of unified. I mean, I think there are certain things that survivors agree on pretty much, but they're not many, but there are some. We might get onto some of those later, but there are some, I would say. But on the whole, there's such diametrically opposed views, I mean, for example, just on something as controversial as ECT, you can get psychiatric survivors that are convinced that it has ruined their lives. But you also get psychiatric survivors that are convinced that it has saved their lives. Now, you can't get more different than that.
Yeah.
Now, what do? Do you just say, well, I don't like ECT, so I'm just going to pick the ones that don't like it, or I think ECT is good, so I'm going to pick. What do you have to? If you're going to do this seriously, you have to include both perspectives. You have to, and you have to. That's what I mean about uncomfortable truths, I think. And also there's a lot of silencing around some of the dynamics involved in survivor politics, for example, that can be as in any politics. There's a lot of disagreement, tension, sometimes bullying, even sometimes the dynamics involved in any sort of group or social movement. And I think there's a tendency to kind of oversimplify and to think, okay, it's just all we need to do is give them the control. If only they had the control, things would be great. And of course that's there's lots of positives about that. And I do think, gone to your question, that if we did it honestly and we started to deal with some of the complexities and the diversity of views and some of the complex dynamics involving people, I guess what that would do would be to ask really difficult questions. Because I think what psychiatric survivors do really brilliantly is to ask those really challenging questions. And I remember, we've published lots of this stuff in Asylum over the years, and I remember one really fascinating piece about prescription abolition. A survivor talked about, let's abolish the prescription system and put it into the hands of service users, maybe in collaboration with pharmacists or whatever. So get rid of the people who prescribe the drugs and just get, and that's a really challenging thought, because it makes you think, well, why is it that certain people have control over administering these things and other people don't? And it really pushes our thinking. And I think that's what psychiatric survivors do. And I remember my first piece of research years ago, 25 years ago, maybe now, talking to young people who self-harmed, really challenged my thinking around, why did we assume that self-harm is necessarily in and of itself a bad, damaging thing, which is what we thought back then. I know things have shifted greatly since then because of what self-harmers and psychiatric survivors have done. But it really sort of pushes our thinking. If we allow that to happen, and if we allow people the space to be able to really and support and facilitate that, then we can start to really, those difficult questions can start to be really thought about and addressed, but only, I think, if we don't sweep the difficulties under the carpet and just pretend it's just an easy transfer of power. Because I think the problem is, and the same with sort of critical professionals and psychiatric survivors and all of us, is that those dynamics that we're trying to sort of struggle against, if you like, or struggle with, we often reproduce.
Right.
The systems we're trying to challenge, if you like, we often reproduce in our understandably in our own ways of organising and our own ways of relating, and it's hard to sort of shake that off, I think. But I think we need to be more honest about some of the difficulties of doing that. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
Yeah,
it totally means we should do it, but we have to do it with more open-mindedness, honesty, and also we have to invest in working with those difficulties. We don't just say, we'll just have a couple of people on a board and we'll just hand the money over or whatever. It's a lot more complex than that. But I think it will, if we do it, and we've seen it over the years, how psychiatric survivors, I can't say psychiatric survivors, but people with we don't usually say, it's important to say actually, because I'm talking about the UK context when I'm talking a lot. And I like the term psychosocial disability, but it's not something that has been really picked up in the UK yet, I don't think. Hence, I talk about psychiatric survivors. And I think the term psychosocial disability also embraces lots of other things broader than psychiatric survivors, if you like. So I think it is helpful because, it can include people with neurodiversity, people with all kinds of, physical and mental health kind of conditions that overlap, if you like. It can include a much more broader range of things. So I think and I think then we can start, because I think one of the things we need to do is learn from different experiences and movements. For example, like the neurodiversity movement, people who've experienced medically unexplained symptoms, things that get labelled chronic fatigue syndrome or ME or various other things, and whose experience has often been psychologized or psychiatrized. I think we can learn a lot from people who've had that experience and people with neurodiverse or things that have been called autism or the autistic spectrum or whatever. And lots of ways in which we could learn from each other about how we can work together to adapt our society in ways that would, going back to the social model of disability, would be really helpful. So I think that's where bringing people together is a really helpful way to do that and start to really learn from each other's experiences.
Absolutely. And it's such a disservice to service users and survivors to just expect that they would all agree with each other and just have this one homogenous voice and, things would be simple. It is, it's kind of, condescending or something, like there is no diversity in thought and experience of this group of people.
Absolutely. Why wouldn't we? It's human diversity, isn't it? We should celebrate. And I guess one of the things I try and do as the Asylum magazine is to open a space for that diversity, because there's lots of voices that still aren't heard. There's lots of voices of people who are really marginalized and maybe don't have a voice in different ways, and, don't feel represented in the mainstream or in the sort of critical alternative either. There's huge amounts of experience we've yet to hear, and we really need to hear that diversity, because it's not until we do that we're going to really start to build something that's hopefully better for us all.
So you've written about the importance of compassion in mental health care, but you have a very different take on compassion. I mean, normally we think of compassion as this internal quality within an individual, but you say it's just as much dependent upon structures and contexts and policies and relations. So could you say more, but kind of specifically talk about what is it specifically about our current mental health culture that makes it difficult for mental health workers to show this compassion, to connect, even when they want to?
It's a huge question, that. Yeah, I mean, there's all the big obvious stuff, the fact that we have a kind of a neoliberal capitalist kind of system which individualizes us, which pits us against each other, that individualizes our problems, that sees us as the problem, and our solutions to our problems is to go and buy more or to be better, and there's always criticizing us that we're never good enough, because if we're not good enough, we'll always keep buying things to make ourselves feel better and all that sort of stuff. So there's all those kind of big stuff that's out there. And in mental health services, obviously, there's huge kind of resource issues, and services have become more and more kind of individualized. There's less and less community-focused projects and services. And when I was always passionate about kind of collective community type provision, therapeutic communities, which I know aren't a panacea, and there's lots of kind of problems with them, but sort of more collective types of provision where people would support each other and would kind of create the context in which compassion could happen. Because I guess that's the point, is that I don't see it again either or. It's either compassion in the individual or compassion in society, but you can't have one without the other. And they go together. We kind of mirrors each other. So unless we create contexts which are more compassionate, and I think the problem with our current society is it's so not compassionate. And there's all this talk about self-care and empathy and all that sort of stuff, but really it kind of often boils down to buying more stuff for yourself. That's often what it boils down to, isn't it? It's like, oh, you deserve it, you're worth it, so go and buy something more. That's kind of, rather than a sort of deeper view of compassion, which is a real sense of connecting with our own suffering and the suffering of others. And that's what compassion really is. But if we have a broader culture that doesn't really want to know about people's suffering, because of course there is much more talk about mental health issues now, but we don't really want to know the depths of people's suffering. And until we're able to do that as a society and as individuals, then it's very hard to create more compassionate kind of context. So it's a big ask, because I'm really asking for a change in society, but obviously it's not. I mean, I talk a lot about prefigurative, politics, that we have to be the change we want to see in the world. There's no point saying we've got to change the world to be like this if we're not prepared to do the work ourselves, to be, to support ourselves and each other. We have to do both. Again, it's not either or. It's not either changing ourselves or changing society, but we can't. One doesn't happen without the other. It has to work together. And I guess mental health services are increasingly uncompassionate. The same with health services as a whole. In the UK, our National Health Service is getting battered, and it's got battered for a long, long time, and it's getting, it's threadbare now. And it wasn't great to start with. Mental health services in the National Health Service were never great, but really they are. And people working in them are struggling themselves, to hold their head up to above water, if you like. It's very hard to be compassionate to others if you're struggling with workload, with no support for yourself, for colleagues, no supervision, no space in which you can get any support. All that kind of stuff is being really, and more and more sort of what we call new managerialism in a way, people focusing on, teaching social workers, for example, we used to teach relationship-based social work practice, and now it's really all about gatekeeping. It's about assessing people, paperwork, all the rest of it, that. And it's very hard because we know compassion comes from being alongside somebody and being with them. Mm. And if you're in front of a computer or you're with paper, filling in paperwork all the time, you cannot generate that sort of. So there's lots of ways in which we are being increasingly distanced from each other. And it's a huge challenge, I think.
You've written about lesbians as psychiatric survivors and how many of their stories remained unknown. And until I read your article, I did not know about it either. So what was it that you found? Could you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, so the background to this was, so people probably know, it's a well sort of trodden story about, homosexuality used to be seen as a mental illness in the DSM and all the rest of it. And there was a big struggle to take it out of the DSM and a big campaign, gay liberation, all the rest of it. And that's a really important sort of part of our history. And that was always something that fascinated me and felt that it was really important in terms of the impact of social movements and stuff like that. In the UK, people know about aversion therapy, I guess, where homosexual men particularly were, and this didn't just happen in the UK. There's some really interesting research coming out now, actually, about, where across the globe where some of this stuff happened. But the UK were particularly enthusiastic about doing this. Well, some psychologists were particularly enthusiastic, behavioural psychologists. So would to try and correct people's homosexuality was to treat them behaviourally in a sort of simplistic behavioural way. So if you view pictures of people of the same sex, you would get an electric shock or given drugs to make you sick, basically. It's to try and decondition you. So it's seen as a conditioned response, a learnt behaviour, rather than something that you're either gay or not, or a choice, or various ways in which you might see sexuality. And there's been quite a bit of research about how some gay men were given aversion therapy, because in the UK, homosexuality was criminalised. Male homosexuality was criminalised, female homosexuality wasn't. So often what happened, men would go through the criminal justice system if they were arrested because of homosexual activity, and they were offered a choice of either being criminalised or having treatment, if you like. And some of the treatments they got was aversion therapy. But I was always fascinated by thinking, well, what happened to women? There's no stories there about what happened to women. Did women get this too? I don't know, So I managed to get a little bit of funding to do, myself and Sarah Carr, to do some research, to archive research, to try and find out. This was all just about England. We just wanted to focus on that because we knew there'd been quite a lot of coverage of gay men and aversion therapy. Not a lot, but some. We knew a bit of that about that story, which is really important. Tommy Dickinson, who was an old colleague of mine, wrote Curing Queers about that history. So we wanted to find out, what happened to women, to same-sex attracted women, or lesbians, bisexual women, or however people wanted to identify. Usually lesbian back in the day, or female homosexual. This is post-war. This is sort of 1960s onwards, late 50s, early 60s, into the late 60s. So we did some sort of archive research to kind of find out. And this is, again, these uncomfortable truths that we were looking at. And we sort of wanted to find them, and we didn't want to find them. Part of us wanted to find stories because we wanted to go, yeah, see, they did it to women too, and how horrible these people were making women do this. But also, obviously, we didn't want to find them. We didn't want to know that women had been through this horrible experience. So we did some archive work to try and look at that. We looked through lesbian archives, through women's archives, through psychiatric survivor archives and stuff like that. We found out that there were a few women that we found about 10 examples of women who'd experienced aversion therapy, and sort of some examples of women who'd experienced other forms of treatment, but really scattered, small very few examples. But we felt they were really important examples because those stories haven't really been heard. And it's always assumed, I think, that aversion therapy was probably given to gay men, and maybe people think maybe it was given to women too, or maybe it wasn't. We don't really know. So we felt that even though it was small numbers, it was still important. But also what we found was that there were lots of examples, there were equal numbers of examples of women who'd gone to see the psychiatrist or their doctor to say, I want to be treated for this because I feel so ashamed and guilty and unhappy about my sexuality. Of course, it wasn't accepted in the 50s and early 60s. And therefore, there was very little chance for women to get a more positive sense of their sexuality or identity. And we found equal numbers of examples of the doctor saying, well, there isn't anything wrong with you. You don't need to be treated. What you need to do is find other people who have similar sexuality to you. And we found some lovely examples of psychiatrists saying, well, there's this Gateways Club, which was a local lesbian club in London, maybe you could go there, and when I say lots of examples, there's similar numbers of examples of positive examples as negative examples. We felt they're also important too, because we need to hear the diversity. We don't just hear the stories that bolster our particular ideology, whether it's to be anti-psychiatry or anti-psychology or whatever. We need to know what actually, we need to know and what we found was that people, there were a small number of psychologists and psychiatrists who were prepared to treat homosexuality in women in this way, with aversion therapy and other treatments. But they were often experimental. They weren't mainstream, but they were endorsed within the particular hospital they were conducted at, but it wasn't a sort of general mainstream treatment. And the practice differed immensely. And we also have to remember that at the time, psychology and psychiatry was embedded or is embedded within the broader culture and society. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, you could argue, or, this is a contentious argument, but some people might argue, well, it was probably better, if you like, if you can see it as better or worse, than going to jail or because previously it was either seen as a criminal or a moral issue. So seeing it as a psychological issue is probably no better or worse. It's another way of pathologizing somebody. But it's not necessarily, it differed in its approach, if you like, but it didn't necessarily conform to what we expected. We didn't know what we'd find, to be honest, but we felt it was important. We also found that a lot of lesbian survivors were very active in contesting the pathologization of male homosexuality as well. They were kind of key kind of activists in that field. I mean, I'm sort of fascinated by that, by the history of activism, I guess, and what it sort of shows up and how we can understand how to institute change, if you like.
You wrote about did a review of the minimal medication approaches for schizophrenia. I think it's a 2009 paper. Could you just tell us what you found and why did you think it was important to kind of work on this, to write about it and research it?
Yeah, so I mean, when I mentioned earlier that there's not that many, there's a lot of disagreement amongst psychiatric survivors, service users, people with psychosocial disabilities. I think one of the things there tends to be not total agreement on, but pretty much a lot of agreement on, is the need for alternatives to inpatient treatment, particularly for people who are experiencing psychosis or, non-consensual reality or whatever you want to call those experiences. And that's something I was always really passionate about as well, the need for genuine asylum for people to go through. And I wrote this other paper, I think before that, around, trying to explore whether people should have a right to go through psychosis with minimal medication and maximum support. Did people have a right to that or not? So I wanted to sort of explore that. And I've always been really passionate that we should be able to provide these kind of spaces. So Lauren Mosher, who was, the key figure around Soteria House in the States, came to the UK in about 2003, I think a year before he died, or maybe the year he died, actually, and inspired us, really. So he came and did a few meetings in the UK, and I went to one of them, and he inspired us to try and set up a Soteria network in the UK, which is still going today. We're still sort of struggling to set up a Soteria House. So I wanted to... I guess to look at, to revisit, what Soteria House was about, the original Soteria House. We enlisted somebody to do a someone who was really skilled at doing a systematic review to revisit some of the data around satyria. Because one of the things we wanted to know was, if you're going to set up a network and set something up, there was something about, I'm very critical of looking at evidence-based sort of stuff, but it felt important to know, what research was there, because it was originally satyria was set up as a research project. So there was obviously some research around there. We wanted to just re-look at it. So, and we did, and we found, that one of the things was that it was at least as effective as mainstream treatment, at least as important. It wasn't necessarily better, but it was at least as effective, which I think is really important sort of nuance. But it was important because if we could show that not giving people medication was as effective as giving medication and putting them in hospital, then that says something quite important, because if people end up on long-term antipsychotics, that can have all sorts of long-term impacts. So that was the kind of thinking behind that, really. And we used it in the Satyria network. We produced an early booklet and we went round commissioners to try and see whether anyone was interested. Because at the time, of course, a lot of closing down inpatient wards, less and less beds, and sometimes there was opportunities to do something different. Right. So and one of the things, if we use that systematic review, if you like, wave it around, it might help. It was one strategy of many. We sort of knew, really. My experience of the therapeutic community movement was that using evidence like that, it isn't always effective, because if the broader context doesn't support that sort of thing, like therapeutic communities and collective approaches, if the broader culture doesn't support that, then it doesn't matter what evidence you throw at, it's not going to happen. But we thought it was one thing we could do amongst many. So that was the kind of thinking behind that, really.
You're right. You kind of had this review and you kind of knew that it might not do much. But now that I look at the massive voices in the field of psychiatry that are coming out and saying things are off, maybe, hopefully, in a way, the reviews did help, right? There is Alan Francis and Robin Murray, and there are other big figures, right? So maybe we wore people down and they revisited their own evidence.
That's the other thing we tried to do. We wanted to get it in a big, high-hitting, because it was in a very big, it was Schizophrenia Bulletin, I think.
Yeah.
That's the paper you're referring to. There was another one we had in Advances in Psychiatric Treatment or something like that. So we wanted to put it in something where it might be read by people who would have influence. And I don't know. I doubt it had much impact. But like you say, you never know. Sometimes it's just about one individual reading something and it makes, who knows? It was one thing we tried to do amongst many. There's lots of other things that were probably much more effective. But, it was one thing I was involved in.
Well, that is it for today. Thank you so much. This was so great. Thank you for, doing this with us.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. Visit madinamerica.com for more news, views and updates.